Following up on our clock for clock 3100 versus 3300X benchmarks, we wanted to see if it's possible to make the 3100 equate the 3300X with a little bit of extra help. So for this one, we're doing some infinity fabric overclocking, and we also changed up the memory. This is getting into sort of personal curiosities and academic research at this point, because realistically, you shouldn't be trying to save $20 off the CPU difference by spending a whole lot more on the memory instead. But we're going to test it to see what happens if you did do that. And we also have the infinity fabric only clocks separately, so we can isolate the memory versus the IF changes and see if it's possible to get the 3100 up to the 3300X in AMD's new Ryzen CPU line. Before that, this video is brought to you by CD Projekt Red and the Cyberpunk 2077 PC modding contest. The Cyberpunk 2077 team is hosting a case modding contest that gives winners the opportunity to work with professional case modders to build the ultimate system. You don't have to do any physical modding to enter the contest, just a mock-up with 3 views of the mod. The theme is "The future is recyclable," and it should be inspired by Cyberpunk, which has countless sources of influence for the work. The contest ends on May 17th, and Cyberpunk's team will select 5 winners to partner with pro case modders to make it a reality. Use any tools you want to make the mock-up of a Cyberpunk-themed build featuring e-waste or recycled materials, and then submit images to the team. Learn more and enter the contest using the link in the description below, or go to cyberpunk.net/cyberup. This is following up on our R3 3100 and 3300X reviews, set at the same clocks. We used 4.4 gigahertz and we changed nothing else. So they kept exactly the same memory, same timings, same frequency, everything, same infinity fabric. The only change was an all-core OC that brought them up to 4.4. And the end result was that there was actually a pretty substantial difference between the two. And that difference is thanks to the 4+0 core configuration on a single CCX, as opposed to a 2+2 core configuration on 2 CCXs for the 3100. So splitting them apart like that adds some latency where you have CCX to CCX latency. There's also an additional interesting point of consideration where now you're splitting the cache too. So no longer do you have all the cache on a single CCX, you have it across both of them. So now if you have cores working in CCX1 and they need to get something out of cache in CCX2, there's going to be an additional latency hit. And that's the penalty that we're trying to see if we can overcome by overclocking some other things in the system to see really how much does that latency impact matter. And just for those who did miss the reviews, to really recap the most important point, what we were trying to point out is that it's not like the 3600 and 3600X where you're paying $50 for a letter that effectively means nothing. It's actually configured differently on a silicon level. So you can't just buy the 3100, clock it up, and save 20 bucks. It doesn't work that way this time. All right, so what we did, the simplest answer to do something other than core is to raise infinity fabric. We have a whole separate piece on infinity fabric and memory overclocking, tuning, all kinds of timing benchmarks. It was really in depth with a whole bunch of different memory kits. And we did that last year with the Ryzen 3000 series launch. Those numbers, that scaling, it hasn't changed. So you can check that content out. We'll try and remember to link it below if you want to learn more about that. But we're taking those concepts and bringing them forward to this content. And the first thing we did was keep the 4.4 gigahertz CPU overclock from the review unchanged. And we added an 1866 megahertz infinity fabric overclock. We couldn't get it higher than that. That seems to be about where these stop being stable. If you went to LN2, you have the additional challenge of having to bring down the infinity fabric to something like 1467 because there's an issue with cold where once you go past, it's different every chip, but something like -90 and -80, you can't get down to -150 without dropping IF. So that's a significant challenge that will present itself when we do eventually go to LN2. But moving on from that, the difference there was going up from 1600 megahertz to 1866. mclock and uClock were left unchanged at 1:1 and then 1600 megahertz. This doesn't require much explanation. We basically just boosted one number here. However, we know from our Ryzen 3000 memory overclocking piece that even better performance can be achieved by increasing fclock, mclock, and uclock in lockstep, as well as optimizing memory timings. This memory overclocking piece is still valid and still accurate to scaling. So again, that'll be linked if you want more info. We're not going to go as deep into it in this piece. Ryzen DRAM Calculator is a well-known and accepted tool for memory tuning on Ryzen at this point. So using 1.7.0, we calculated ideal settings for our 2 sticks of 8 GB 3866 MHz G.Skill Trident Z memory. We used the same Gigabyte X570 master board that we used in the CPU review previously, so we'll be able to compare our results to the previously logged results Although we've found that the MSI X5 Sony Godlike is superior for memory overclocking in general. The 4.4 GHz CPU overclock we tested in the review was left in place with an unnecessarily high but still thermally safe on our bench V-core set to ensure no instability from that change. During original testing, our 3100 was stable with a set voltage of 1.343 volts and could perhaps have gone even lower. We found that setting the memory to 3866 MHz was forcing us into 2-to-1 mode, whether we wanted it or not. So retaining these same settings, we downclocked to 3666 MHz DDR and successfully booted with a 1-to-1-to-1, which is the most important part for Ryzen overclocking in this aspect, 1833 speed for Infinity Fabric, memory clock, and memory controller clock. That should give us the best results within reason. AMD's latest Ryzen Master Guide says that, quote, above a memory clock of 1866 MHz, turning coupled mode off and setting fabric clock to half the memory clock will likely be necessary for further memory timing parameter optimization towards system stability. Hence our chosen clock speed below 1866. We managed at 1900 1-to-1-to-1 in the original Ryzen 3000 memory OC guide, but that was a different CPU, different motherboard, and mileage may vary. Okay, enough explaining the testing. We'll get into the actual benchmarks now, and another final note here that we're trying to look at, can the 3100 meet the 3300X? So we're going to focus on some of the games and scenarios where the gap was wider. We have a couple in there where it's smaller, like Civilization 6, just for perspective, but the focus here is going to be on those wider gap games. And finally, the 3300X is obviously just as capable of doing all these things as the 3100. So we have those numbers in a couple of the games, but not all of them. The focus again is on the 3100. Let's get started with the gaming benchmarks. F1 2019 is up first. This one does an excellent job of highlighting differences between CPUs in general, but the high FPS averages can make differences seem more dramatic than they actually are. 200 FPS average for the 4.4 GHz 3100 versus 239 FPS average for the 4.4 GHz 3300X is a big difference, but it's still a 19.3% uplift. So not quite as dramatic as with the Three Kingdoms campaign benchmark. Unlike Three Kingdoms, F119 proved at least somewhat responsive to our tuning, with a 2.9% uplift from a plain F-clock increase, going from 200 FPS average to 206, and a 4.7% increase from the full suite of tuning and clock adjustments, up to 209 FPS average. That reduces the 3300X's lead to 14%, but frankly speaking, that's still a massive difference for two AMD CPUs that are nominally running at the same speed. The 3300X remains the better buy, especially since we ran the 3300X with the 3200 MHz standardized memory test kit that we use on all platforms. You'd be better off spending the $20 more on the CPU and then less money on memory, even running it stock. The tune on the 3300X didn't change the results too much, especially given F1's higher FPS and therefore higher volatility in the finer details. The campaign benchmark for Total War Three Kingdoms tells a similar story, with the 3300X scoring a 25.2% advantage at 124 FPS average, and that's when overclocked versus the overclocked 3100 at 99.4 FPS average. There's only a small 2.1% boost over the original overclocked result for the 3100, resulting from the memory tuning, and that's at 102 FPS average. This is one of the titles with the most dramatic differences between the two R3s, and one where we most expected to see Infinity Fabric overclocking and the memory tune have more of an effect. But a factor other than plain clock speeds is at work here. The 3300X with 3666 memory and 1-to-1-to-1 mode scored within test variance of the 4.4 GHz all-core result, both at around 124 FPS average. Total War's battle benchmark is next. The overclocked R3 3300X scored an especially high 13.9% higher than the overclocked 3100 in Total War Three Kingdoms battle benchmark at 1080p, but neither raising F-clock nor tuning memory with F-clock, mclock, and uClock all increased, caused the results to stray significantly from 113 FPS average. The results were within test-to-test variance of the 4.4 GHz all-core overclock without any tuning. These are within error, and we can't measure any difference outside of test variance, so they're functionally the same in this particular benchmark. The Division 2 chart still has slightly fewer CPUs on it than the rest as we catch up following our decision to switch to medium settings, but all of the R3 tests were run through this benchmark. The overclocked R3 3300X had a now typical advantage of 14.8% over the overclocked 3100 at 1080p, and that's with both at 4.4 GHz all-core. Raising F-clock gave minor uplift to 164 FPS average on the 3100, and the full set of tunings and overclocks raised performance 2% versus the plain all-core overclock. Again, the 3300X maintains a solid lead even as we attempt to counter the disadvantages of the 3100. The gap is now 12.5% instead of 14.8%, and that's with the 3300X still on 3200 MHz memory for our standard reviews, so still a plenty wide gap. It may, again, just be better to buy the 3300X. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p is next, and it lines up closely with the results we've seen so far. The original 3300X overclock had a 15.4% lead over the 3100's overclock of a 121 FPS average for the result. Raising F-clock had no significant impact and was within variance, and memory tuning in combination with the overclock raised performance 4.1% over the all-core only OC. The typical pattern we've seen is that the 3300X outperforms the 3100 at the same static multiplier. Raising F-clock alone has little to no effect on this, and running faster memory while simultaneously raising F-clock and uClock offers a minor performance advantage, but still doesn't put the 3100 at the same level as the 3300X. The 3300X is equally capable of running faster memory and clocks, and it benefited at 141 FPS average from 139.7 previously, so even that small bump for the 3100 doesn't mean that much. Not that it means much for the 3300X either, of course. Hitman 2 is one of those several tests where the overclocked 3100 couldn't beat the stock 3300X. At 103 FPS average versus 114 FPS average, the 3300X obviously maintains a lead. Simply raising F-clock caused no measurable change in the overall average, but raising the memory speed as well did cause a 3.5% uplift versus the original overclocked result. That's not exactly mind-blowing, and the fact that the F-clock increase alone didn't help is a good indicator that the memory tuning is more responsible for the improvement and also potentially more expensive of a jump than just the 3300X with the same memory. The 3300X remains solidly ahead here. Our Civ 6 turn time benchmark is next, looking at the time in seconds required to complete the average turn for an AI player. The R3 3100 decreased time required from 40.3 seconds to 38.3, which is a meaningful difference in this highly accurate and consistent bench. So we saw a reduction of 5% time required. The F-clock OC and MEM OC results moved to about 38 and 38.2 seconds, so not a huge change. The 3300X remains at 35.3 seconds for both of its OC results. Memory timings also play a role here for the simpler F-clock overclock, where the CL14 3200 result is plotting marginally better than the CL16 3666 result. This chart is for Red Dead Redemption 2 with DX12 and 1080p high. We may increasingly move away from high settings in Red Dead 2 as a CPU benchmark in the future because of the obvious GPU limitations. But for now, the 3300X and 3100 are at least measurably below the performance level of the 3600, and therefore not hitting a GPU limitation at 1080p. The core overclocks on the 3100 and 3300X had barely any effect on either chip in this test, and the 4.4 GHz 3300X had a 10% advantage over the 4.4 GHz 3100. Tuning the memory with a 1:1:1 1833 MHz configuration raised the average FPS from 100 to 102 for the 3100, while just raising the F-clock to 1866 with our original kit of memory did just as well within margin of error, achieving 103 FPS average. That reduces the overclocked 3300X's advantage to 6.6%, but it's still obviously in the lead. Note that there's, again, potential for a memory timing impact to play more of a role than just the frequency, but we don't have the test resolution to actually see a measurable difference between 109.8 and 109.5. Medium settings create more of a CPU bottleneck for Red Dead using the DX12 API, but since the game is fairly CPU limited by the R3s even at high settings, OC versus OC, the 3300X only has a slightly higher 11.2% advantage here. The result with tuned memory is again slightly higher than the result with a simple F-clock increase in this test, more in line with what we'd expect than the high results. At 106 FPS average, the tuned result is a 4.1% improvement over the plain OC for all-core and reduces the 3300X's OC versus OC advantage to 6.8%. Red Dead 2 with Vulkan and these settings is pretty useless as a CPU benchmark, but it shows exactly why we avoid bottlenecks in CPU reviews. They don't teach us anything about the CPU because obviously a 9900K isn't equal to a 7700K or that close to a 3300X. Vulkan is the default API though for Red Dead 2, so we'll cover the results with it as well. The 3300X is 9.2% ahead of the 3100 in OC versus OC performance at 4.4 GHz only, no other tunes. And although a plain F-clock increase had no impact on the average, tuning memory as well raised performance for the 3100's OC by 3.8% up to 117 FPS average. and reduced the overclocked 3300X's lead to 5.8%. These are the same results as with DX12, but with smaller margins due to the greater GPU limitations. Grand Theft Auto 5 at 1080p has all of the R3s relatively close together in performance, with a range from 89 FPS average for the stock 3100 to 105 FPS average for the overclocked 3300X. Within that limited range, the CPUs stack up as they have in the other tests. The 3300X 4.4 GHz is 8.3% ahead of the 3100 at 105 FPS average to 97 FPS average with both overclocked. Raising the F-clock alone had no significant impact, and the comprehensive tuning and overclocking raised performance by 1.8% versus the straight 4.4 GHz all-core overclock, failing still to bring it to the 3300X's level of performance, stock or otherwise. 7-zip is up next. We didn't bother running the full suite of enterprise tests with just an F-clock increase, since it had been fairly well established that the tuned memory was giving us more of a performance advantage. That didn't hold true for 7-zip, where the decompressed score was effectively identical to the original overclocked 3100 result. There's almost no difference in any of the results here outside of the stock 3100 CPU, so this task just doesn't seem to care. Photoshop didn't take well to our memory tuning, although the original 3300X overclock had a 10.1% advantage over the 3100's overclock in overall score. The result with the faster memory and tuning was a couple percent lower. That's probably because the CL14 timings at 3200 are helping more than the 3600 CL16 configuration, so we've hit diminishing returns on frequency. The memory changes caused minor performance uplifts in our render benchmarks like V-Ray, Premiere, and Blender, so we'll use Blender as a summary of those results. The 3300X OC originally rendered our monkey head render scene in 2.7% faster time than the 3100 OC at 25.4 minutes versus 26.1 minutes, but with the memory change it was just under 2% faster. The logo render finished in 31.4 minutes on the 4.4 GHz 3300X and 32.1 minutes on the 4.4 GHz 3100, making the 3300X 2.2% faster. With memory tuning and clock increases, the 3100 finished in 31.8 minutes, making the 3300X a little over 1% faster. These results are roughly representative of those other benchmarks as well, although the exact numbers are different. The overclocks aren't hugely different in performance to begin with. Although the performance deficit on the 3100 is largely due to splitting the cores across different CCXs as opposed to the 3300X, this deficit isn't as easy to make up as just simply cranking the Infinity Fabric as high as it can go. And even doing different memory, leaving the 3300X on 3200 MHz memory, although still with CL14, that didn't really help in this scenario either. It gets it closer, but we were unable to equate 3300X performance with the 3100 and all of that additional tuning. So this is our best effort at looking into this without going too ridiculous. Obviously, you could always do more. We could do liquid nitrogen, doesn't really count. We could also start spending, in theory, a whole lot more of the assumed budget on memory, and even that isn't really going to get you there. So the end result here is that it's better to just spend the extra $20 on the 3300X than it would be to do all of this other stuff on the 3100 and still have a worse performer overall. Part of the issue here, again, might be the separation of the cache as well, where you're splitting it into groups of 8 megabytes L3 instead of 16 on the single CCX for the 3300X. So artificial product segmentation or not, the end result here is that finally there's an instance where the lower end of the Ryzen CPUs with the same core count configuration is unable to just be overclocked to match its higher end counterpart with an X at the end of it. And so in that regard, we think that the 3100 is probably going to be more like the 1200 and the 1300X relationship in the original Ryzen launch, where one of them is just forgotten. And it's because they're close enough in price, but not that close in some applications in performance, not proportionally. You're often paying less than $1 per percentage point gained, if you want to look at it that way. So the 3300X does just seem like objectively the better deal if you can stretch the extra $20 in your budget. If you can't, well, the 3100's fine. The 1600AF is a whole hell of a lot more appealing at $85, and AMD is still pushing them to channel. You will still be able to buy them, where you here is the second person is maybe a bit ambiguous, because you might end up actually just being scalpers. You sell it for 100 to 150 bucks instead. But if you can grab one, it's a way better deal than a 3100 for sure. There's absolutely no point to buying a 3100 if you can get a 1600 AF for its actually intended MSRP. So anyway, yeah, 3300X looks pretty good here. The gap can't be just magically erased with additional overclocking, at least not without getting into levels that aren't realistic anymore. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly with stuff like this. It's a significant help and allows us to reduce our reliance on advertisers. So thank you for your support there, and we'll see you all next time.